On the 25th of May, 1940, Winston Churchill sat down in the cabinet war rooms beneath London and dictated a telegram to a man he was about to kill. Not with a bullet, not with a bomb. With 7 words: "Evacuation will not, repeat not, take place." That telegram went to Brigadier Claude Nicholson, the commander of a British brigade trapped in the French port of Calais, surrounded by German tanks, running out of ammunition, running out of food, and running out of time. Nicholson had been told just hours earlier that his men would be rescued. Ships were on the way, but Churchill cancelled those ships because he needed Nicholson and his men to keep fighting, to keep dying, so that 338,000 other soldiers could escape from Dunkirk, 22 miles up the coast. Churchill later wrote that after sending that message, he sat silently at the dinner table, and he could not help feeling physically sick. This is the story of the brigade that Churchill ordered to die so that Dunkirk could live, and it starts 2 weeks earlier, when the entire war in Western Europe fell apart in a way that nobody saw coming. On the 10th of May, 1940, Germany launched its invasion of France and the Low Countries. The British had sent an expeditionary force across the English Channel months before, and those soldiers were positioned in Belgium and northern France alongside the French army. Everyone expected the German attack to come through Belgium, the same route the Kaiser's army had taken in 1914. And, in a way, it did. German forces poured into Belgium and the Netherlands, and the Allied armies moved north to meet them, exactly as planned. But that was the trap. While the Allies committed their best units to Belgium, the real blow came further south, through the Ardennes forest. The French High Command believed the Ardennes was impassable for tanks. Dense woods, narrow roads, steep terrain. No armored force could push through there in any useful time frame. That was the conventional wisdom, and the French generals were so confident in it that they left the Ardennes sector defended by second-rate reserve divisions, men who were older, less equipped, and far less prepared for what was about to hit them. On May the 13th, 7 German panzer divisions punched through at Sedan, crossed the River Meuse, and broke into open country behind the Allied lines. What happened next stunned every military planner in Europe. The panzer columns didn't stop to consolidate their gains. They didn't wait for the slower infantry divisions to catch up and secure the flanks. They just drove west, flat out, straight for the English Channel, like a knife cutting across the map of northern France. French units that tried to stand in their way were brushed aside or bypassed. Communication lines collapsed. Headquarters lost contact with frontline units. The French command structure, built for the methodical pace of the last war, simply could not process what was happening fast enough to respond. Within 10 days, German tanks had reached the coast near Abbeville, and roughly 400,000 British and French troops were trapped in a pocket along the northern French coast, with their backs to the sea and no clear way out. By the 3rd week of May, the situation was beyond desperate. The British Expeditionary Force was being squeezed into a shrinking perimeter around Dunkirk, and the German panzer divisions were racing north along the Channel coast, gobbling up the port towns one by one. Boulogne was under attack. Calais was next. And if Calais fell quickly, the road to Dunkirk would be wide open. That is where the 30th Infantry Brigade comes in. And to understand why what happened to them was so cruel, you need to know who they were. This was not a ragtag collection of reservists. The 30th Brigade had been formed just weeks earlier, in April of 1940, and it was built from some of the finest units in the British Army. The 2nd Battalion of the King's Royal Rifle Corps, the 1st Battalion of the Rifle Brigade, the 1st Battalion of the Queen Victoria's Rifles. These were elite, professional soldiers, motor battalions trained for rapid mobile warfare. They were joined by the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment with their cruiser and light tanks. The brigade was originally put together for an operation in Norway, but that plan was scrapped. On the 22nd and 23rd of May, they were loaded onto ships at Dover and sent across the Channel to Calais instead. They had almost no idea what they were walking into. The men loaded onto transport ships at Dover thinking they might be heading to bolster a defensive line or secure a supply route. Many of them didn't receive clear briefings before departure. They crossed the channel in a matter of hours, and when they stepped off the ships at Calais, they found a port that was already being bombed by the Luftwaffe. The docks were damaged. Smoke hung over the waterfront. And the military situation on the ground was changing so fast that the orders they had been given in England were already out of date by the time they arrived. Brigadier Claude Nicholson, the brigade commander, was 41 years old. He had served in the First World War as a teenager, fought in Palestine, India, and Egypt, and commanded a cavalry regiment before the war. He was the kind of officer the British Army relied on when things went badly. Steady, competent, professional. When Nicholson arrived at Calais, he found chaos. There were already some British anti-aircraft units and French troops in the port, but the situation was confused. Orders from London were contradictory and kept changing by the hour. First, Nicholson was told to move south and reinforce Boulogne. His tanks headed out, but they ran straight into elements of the German 1st Panzer Division near the town of Guines and were badly mauled. About half the British tanks were knocked out in that engagement, and the survivors pulled back to Calais. Then Nicholson received a different order. He was to escort a convoy of supply trucks east along the coast road to Dunkirk, carrying rations for the British Expeditionary Force. He tried that too. His men pushed out toward the Dunkirk road in the early hours of May the 24th, but the road was already blocked by German forces. The convoy could not get through. By the morning of the 24th, it was obvious. Calais was surrounded. The Germans held the roads to the south, the east, and the west. The only way out was by sea, and then the siege began. General Heinz Guderian, the commander of the German 19th Army Corps, had ordered the 10th Panzer Division to take Calais. The division was commanded by Major General Ferdinand Schall, and his men were tired. They had already fought a brutal two-day battle at Stonne the week before, and Schall complained that more than half his armored vehicles were out of action from battle damage and mechanical breakdown before the assault on Calais even started. But tired or not, the 10th Panzer Division attacked on the 24th of May, and they attacked hard. Tanks rolled toward the town, infantry moved up behind them. Artillery pounded the defensive positions from the south. What they ran into surprised them. The British had fallen back behind the old fortification walls of Calais, stone ramparts that dated back to the 1670s. These walls were thick, they were solid, and the British riflemen used them brilliantly. When the Germans threw their tanks and infantry at those positions, they were cut to pieces. By the end of that first day, the 10th Panzer Division reported that about half its remaining tanks had been knocked out. A third of its infantry were casualties. The German attacks kept failing because the defenders were skilled, they were determined, and they were fighting from strong positions with clear fields of fire. Royal Navy destroyers offshore, including ships like HMS Grafton and HMS Greyhound, poured shells onto the German positions from the sea. For that first day, the defenders of Calais held firm, and the Germans paid a steep price for every meter they gained. But the situation inside the perimeter was getting worse by the hour. Ammunition was running low. There was no organized resupply system. Food was scarce, and the men hadn't eaten properly since landing. Clean water was hard to find because the bombing had wrecked the town's infrastructure. The Luftwaffe was bombing the port constantly, Stuka dive bombers screaming down on the defenders' positions, and fires were burning across the old town of Calais, rubble-blocked streets that had been clear that morning. The stench of cordite and burning timber hung over everything. Nicholson moved his headquarters from the Boulevard Leon Gambetta to the Gare Maritime, the railway station on the waterfront, as the German infantry pushed deeper into the outskirts. On the southern perimeter, the Germans broke through the defenses and could not be pushed back. German soldiers who got inside the perimeter began firing into the British positions from houses they had captured, shooting along the line of the defenders from the side, which is about the worst thing that can happen to a unit trying to hold a fixed position. The 229th Battery of Royal Artillery was reduced to just 2 functioning anti-tank guns. The Polish destroyer Berza joined the Royal Navy ships offshore, adding its guns to the defense. Small naval craft slipped into the harbor under fire, and managed to pull out around 400 wounded men. The RAF and the Fleet Air Arm dropped what supplies they could from the air. But it was never going to be enough. And this is where the story takes its ugliest turn. Throughout the night of May the 23rd into the 24th, nobody knew whether the brigade would be evacuated. The War Office in London seemed to go back and forth. Nicholson spoke by telephone with the War Office and described his situation, and the officials on the other end seemed to agree that there was little the defenders could do to change the larger picture, and that Calais could not really be held even with reinforcements. Nicholson was told that in principle it had been decided to evacuate his brigade. Ships would come, his men would be pulled out, just like the garrison at Boulogne had been. Then, at 3 in the morning on the 24th, a message confirmed it. The 30th Brigade would be evacuated. Nicholson ordered his staff to begin preparing an evacuation plan to be carried out the following night. His men were going home. But those orders were reversed. Throughout the 24th and into the 25th, the messages from London shifted. Telegrams arrived exhorting Nicholson to fight for Allied solidarity. He was told that various units were advancing from Dunkirk to relieve him. None of that was true. No relief was coming. There were no units advancing to his aid. The promises were hollow, and whether the men sending those messages knew they were lying or simply didn't know the truth on the ground, the effect was the same. And then, on the evening of May the 25th, the port of Boulogne fell. With Boulogne gone, Calais was the last position between the German panzer divisions and the beaches of Dunkirk. And that is when Churchill made his decision. At 9 in the evening on May the 25th, Churchill sent his telegram to Nicholson. "Every hour you continue to exist is of the greatest help to the British Expeditionary Force. Government has therefore decided you must continue to fight. Have greatest possible admiration for your splendid stand. Evacuation will not, repeat not, take place, and craft required for above purpose are to return to Dover." Read that again. The ships that were supposed to save those men were being turned around. The rescue that Nicholson had been promised, that his men were counting on, was cancelled. Churchill, along with Secretary of State for War Anthony Eden and the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, had made a calculated decision. They would sacrifice the 30th Brigade to buy time for Dunkirk. Eden sent his own message. The eyes of the Empire are on the defense of Calais. Nicholson received these orders, and he followed them. On the night of the 25th, he restated to his officers and men that there would be no evacuation. The troops now knew the fate they faced. It was a warm, clear night along the French coast. Several Royal Navy warships were visible offshore, and some of the soldiers still held on to hope that the ships would take them off. But the ships were there to provide gunfire support, not rescue. The brigade was on its own. The final day came on Sunday, the 26th of May, 1940. At dawn, the German bombardment intensified beyond anything the defenders had experienced. 200 Luftwaffe bombers appeared over Calais and pounded the port into rubble. The old stone walls crumbled under the barrage, buildings collapsed, fires spread through the streets. The German infantry attacked from 3 sides simultaneously, supported by whatever tanks they had left. The fighting was savage and close, the kind of combat that no amount of training fully prepares you for. It moved from the ramparts into the streets, from the streets into individual buildings, room by room, floor by floor. The defenders were running out of everything. Ammunition was nearly gone. According to some accounts, soldiers who had exhausted their rifle rounds resorted to throwing empty wine bottles at the advancing German troops. It sounds absurd, but when you have nothing left, you fight with what you have. Lieutenant Colonel Chandos Hoskins, commanding the Rifle Brigade, was mortally wounded during the fighting. He would later die of his wounds in England after being evacuated by one of the last small boats. By the late afternoon, the Germans broke through the final defensive positions around the Gare Maritime and the old citadel. Nicholson and his brigade major, Captain Dennis Talbot, were captured sometime between 4:30 and 5 in the afternoon. After 4 days of fighting, Calais fell. Roughly 3,000 British soldiers and 800 French troops were taken prisoner. Only about 30 unwounded British survivors were brought off by the Royal Navy in the final hours. 30 men out of more than 3,000. And here is the thing that makes this story land with its full weight. The very next day, the 27th of May, 1940, the first British soldiers were evacuated from Dunkirk. Operation Dynamo had begun on the 26th, the same day Calais fell. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay directed the operation from the tunnels beneath Dover Castle, coordinating an armada of warships, merchant vessels, and civilian boats. On the first day, the evacuation was painfully slow. Only about 8,000 men were rescued. But as the operation gathered pace, the numbers climbed. The famous little ships arrived, fishing boats and pleasure craft and Thames River ferries, civilian vessels crewed by ordinary people who crossed the channel under Luftwaffe bombing and machine gun strafing to pull soldiers off the shallow beaches where the big warships couldn't reach. They ferried men out to the destroyers and transport ships waiting in deeper water, trip after trip, under fire the entire time. Churchill and his advisors had expected to save maybe 20,000 men, 30,000 if they were lucky. Over the next 9 days, 338,226 soldiers were rescued. British, French, and Belgian troops pulled off the beaches and the harbour mole at Dunkirk and brought back to England. 933 vessels took part. 200 ships were sunk. Thousands of soldiers and sailors and civilian volunteers died during the evacuation. But nearly 10 times as many men were saved as anyone had thought possible. If those men had been captured or killed, Britain would have lost its only trained army. The war in Europe might well have ended right there in the summer of 1940. The evacuation at Dunkirk saved the Allied cause, and the men at Calais helped make it possible by tying down the 10th Panzer Division for 4 critical days, while the Dunkirk perimeter was organized and the evacuation fleet was assembled. Now, historians have argued about exactly how much the defense of Calais contributed to the success of Dunkirk. Guderian himself denied that Calais was the reason his panzers didn't reach Dunkirk, pointing instead to Hitler's controversial halt order on the 23rd of May, which froze the panzer advance for crucial days. And German records suggest that only a modest part of the 10th Panzer Division's strength was ever directed against Calais at any one time. In 1966, the British official historian Lionel Ellis wrote that 3 panzer divisions had been diverted by the defense of Boulogne and Calais, giving the Allies time to close a gap west of Dunkirk. Decades later, the German historian Karl-Heinz Frieser argued that the halt order mattered more than the siege. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The halt order was the bigger factor. But the defense of Calais tied down a panzer division that could have been used elsewhere, and it forced the Germans to commit resources and time they didn't want to spend. At minimum, every hour the garrison held was an hour the defenders of Dunkirk had to dig in and prepare. And Churchill clearly believed it mattered, because he ordered those men to fight to the last rather than bring them home. On the 4th of June, 1940, Churchill stood before Parliament and spoke about the defense of Calais. He named the units: the Rifle Brigade, the 60th Rifles, the Queen Victoria's Rifles. He told the House of Commons that the British Brigadier had been given an hour to surrender and had spurned the offer, and that 4 days of intense street fighting followed before silence fell over the town. He said that only 30 unwounded survivors had been brought off by the Royal Navy and that the fate of their comrades was unknown. And he said their sacrifice was not in vain. But the man who led that defense never got to hear those words, and he never got to tell his side of the story. Brigadier Claude Nicholson was taken to a prisoner of war camp near Salzburg, Austria, and later transferred to Oflag 9AZ in Rothenburg on the Fulda River in central Germany. As a substantive brigadier, he was the second most senior British Army officer among all the prisoners of war held by Germany at that time. He took on the responsibility of representing British officers in their dealings with the German camp authorities, enforcing discipline among the prisoners, and trying to maintain morale in conditions that ground men down month after month, year after year. Before the war, Nicholson had been an officer with a promising future, a career cavalryman with experience across multiple continents. Now he was a man behind barbed wire, carrying the knowledge that he had been deliberately sacrificed by his own government, and that the men under his command had paid the price. While imprisoned, Nicholson was approached by the Germans and asked to serve as an independent witness to the Katyn massacre, where roughly 20,000 Polish officers and intellectuals had been killed by the Soviets. The Germans wanted British and American officers to verify their findings for propaganda purposes. Nicholson, as the senior British officer, refused. He did not want to be part of a German propaganda effort. The senior American officer at the camp, Colonel John Van Vliet, also initially refused, though he and another American were eventually forced to go. On the 26th of June, 1943, 3 years and 1 month after the fall of Calais, Claude Nicholson died. He was 44 years old. His death was officially recorded as suicide. The German death certificate stated that he threw himself from a window at Rothenburg Castle, suffering a skull fracture. Fellow prisoners described being shocked. They said they had seen no signs beforehand. Some of them, and some historians since, have questioned whether it was truly suicide or something else. We will probably never know. Nicholson was awarded the Companion of the Order of the Bath in 1945, backdated to the day before his death. His widow and his children received the honor on his behalf. He never came home. He never had the chance to write his memoirs or give interviews or set the record straight about what happened at Calais. Everything we know comes from the men who survived around him, from the official records and from the accounts pieced together after the war. The men of the 30th Brigade who survived captivity came home after the war ended in 1945. They had spent 5 years as prisoners. 5 years knowing they had been deliberately sacrificed by their own government. 5 years carrying the weight of those 4 days in Calais. Their story was overshadowed almost immediately by the larger narrative of Dunkirk, the miracle, the little ships, the beaches, the spirit of survival. Calais was the cost of that miracle, and it has stayed in the shadows ever since. Churchill himself wrestled with the decision for the rest of his life. He had made the cold calculation that the lives of a few thousand men were worth sacrificing to save hundreds of thousands. And by the numbers, he was right. 338,000 soldiers came home because of Dunkirk. Britain survived the summer of 1940 because those men were alive to defend the island. The war was eventually won because that army existed to fight again. But you cannot look at the story of Calais and feel clean about it. These were men who were told they would be rescued, and then told they wouldn't. They were ordered to fight, knowing it would end in death or capture, not to win a battle, but to buy time for someone else's escape. They did it anyway. They fought until their ammunition ran out, and then they kept fighting. And the man who led them died in a German prison camp 3 years later, surrounded by questions that have never been answered. Churchill said their sacrifice was not in vain, and maybe he was right about that too. The arithmetic of war is brutal that way. You can justify almost any sacrifice if the alternative is worse. And the alternative to holding Calais, the potential loss of the entire British expeditionary force, would have been catastrophic beyond anything Churchill was willing to accept. But it is worth remembering that when we talk about Dunkirk, when we celebrate the miracle and the little ships and the 338,000 who came home, there were men at Calais who made that possible. Men who didn't come home. Men whose names most people have never heard. Men who spent their last rounds and threw empty bottles because they had nothing else, and who went into captivity knowing they had been written off as an acceptable loss. That is the part of the Dunkirk story that usually gets left out, and that is why it is worth telling. If this story hit you the way it hit me, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me what you think about Churchill's decision. And if you want more stories like this, hit the like button so more people can find this video.